Today we are ranking older generation UFC fighters based on how overrated or underrated they are. Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. If you are new here, my name is Kyle. I'm your guy with many YouTube channels, and welcome back to another tier list video, everybody, where we rank things. A little bit of a series in the channel we have going on here. So I was going to make a really fun tier list because I had the idea from Bedtime MMA, who made a great tier list on toxic UFC fighters, and I thought of a nice spin on that idea. So I was gonna put together a tier list, but then I went to my mom's today and I laid on her couch and she gave me a pillow and a blanket and I fell asleep for like 4 hours. So now I'm here, don't have time to I don't have time to build an entire tier list. So I was looking under the popular section and this one was actually there, and I thought it would have like a bunch of fighters from today, but it seems like this tier list was made a long time ago, which I still think, honestly, taking a look at these fighters, because this seems to be the generation that I really got into UFC. So I still want to rank these fighters today. I want to take a look at these guys. Let's take a look if they're overrated, underrated. Let's get into the video, guys. Sorry about the really long intro there. Let's talk BJ Penn. Now, I'm gonna have a little bit of trouble here because these fighters went out pretty bad. Somebody like BJ Penn, right? So I think I'm going to rate them like in hindsight. How would they kind of do in today's MMA game? That's kind of how I think that I should rate them. And BJ Penn, man, BJ Penn, people talk about him like he's an absolute legend, but yeah, I think BJ Penn's overrated, man. I think I'm gonna put him in the A tier. So of course, like I said, or like I didn't say, S is overrated and F is underrated. Michael Bisping, and I would imagine C. I'll edit C to be fairly rated. Let's do that. Let's do that. Perfect. So Michael Bisping, honestly, I think people had a really good gauge on Michael Bisping. There was nothing honestly too special about him, but he was a good fighter. He became a champion. I believe Michael Bisping to be fairly rated. Now, Rafael dos Anjos, I think he was also fairly rated, man. Everybody looks at him like he was a legend of the sport. He was a killer in his prime. Everybody looked out for Rafael dos Anjos back in the day. I think he was fairly rated. Now, Rampage Jackson, honestly, I also think is fairly rated. I think he's fairly rated. Everybody kind of looked at him like Michael Bisping. Everybody knew that he wasn't exactly, at least at the later stage of his career, championship material. Rampage Jackson, I'm a big fan of, but I think he was fairly rated. Jan Blachowicz. Blachowicz is definitely an underrated fighter. A little bit more on the underrated side. I think people are just now coming to notice how good Jan Blachowicz is, and I myself underrated him as well. I believe Jan is a very underrated fighter. Now, Rashad Evans. This is an interesting one. This is a very interesting one because I kind of want to teeter lines with him and think that he's like just a tad overrated or fairly rated, but I am leaning into fairly rated. Rashad Evans is pretty fairly rated. With Uriah Faber, this one's tough because Uriah Faber was a good fighter. He was a good fighter, but people also like looked at him like he was never going to be champion, and he never really was champion unless you want to go back into his early career. But this one's tough. This one's tough. Is he fairly rated or is he slightly underrated? I'm going to put Uriah Faber at slightly underrated because when people do talk about Uriah Faber, like, oh my god, bum chin, Conor McGregor roasted him, you know, kind of like that. But at the end of the day, he was almost fairly rated in the sense where people kind of had a decent gauge of his skill set. Now let's talk about Ben Askren. Ben Askren is in the F tier, absolutely underrated. Yeah, you know what? He has subpar stand-up, but you can't, like, everybody's judging him off of just his UFC performances. And yeah, you know what? Okay. I'm not saying he's some world beater, okay? I'm just saying that people look at Ben Askren and think like everybody watching could beat up Ben Askren. Maybe now with his hip replacement now that he's old, but when Ben Askren was fighting, he was a pretty good fighter. He uses wrestling very well. Just go watch any of his fights over at one. Ben Askren does have his accomplishments. I think he is our first F tier to be underrated. It's sad that Ben Askren's being thrown into an F tier. But anyways, George St. Pierre. Ooh, this one's tough. Ooh, guys, I think GSP is a little bit overrated. Just a little bit. I think he is B tier. Don't get me wrong, he is a contender to be one of the greatest of all time. But I don't think George St. Pierre stacks up to guys like when you talk about the greatest of all time, ignoring PEDs, of course. You talk about John Jones, you talk about Demetrius Johnson, you talk about Khabib Nurmagomedov, you talk about a few of these guys like Volkanovski. I know that's not necessarily the case right now, but I don't believe that GSP fits in the conversation with those guys. He is one of the greatest of all time, but to put him on like the Mount Rushmore of MMA, I don't think so, man. I don't think so. I do believe Kamaru Usman would have beat the brakes off GSP. If they were fighting prime for prime, I think Kamaru Usman would handle that man. I wholeheartedly believe that. I'm ready to hear the comments down below. All right. Now, Conor McGregor. It's interesting because nowadays, Conor McGregor is fairly rated. People understand his skill sets. People understand that he's clearly out of his prime, but you still have the McGregor fans who will kind of die on the McGregor hill. You know what I mean? You still have the Conor McGregor fans that will still talk about him chinning Islam Makhachev. So I think Conor McGregor, guys, is going to be slightly overrated. I'm going to throw him into the B tier. Now, Petr Yan. Okay, you have a little bit of a mixture with Petr Yan because you have fans like me who still think he's one of the greatest bantamweights of all time. I still believe that Petr Yan could be champion. You throw him in there with Sean O'Malley, he already beat Sean O'Malley. And I think that Petr Yan is championship material. And you also have a slice of the MMA community who all collectively think that Petr Yan is good, but he's overrated by the MMA community. So Petr Yan is very difficult to gauge. I will throw him in the fairly rated though, because I just feel like that's proper. Now, Travis Brown is a little bit underrated. Just a little bit. I'm going to throw him into the D tier. Travis Brown is a little bit underrated. I know he got chinny. I know he lost a lot of fights at the end of his career, but Travis Brown was a killer in his day. Travis Brown was a very, very dangerous fighter to go up against. He just happened to get caught by Derek Lewis, and then everybody started talking about the Derek Lewis dance whenever Travis Brown gets hit. Travis Brown had a lot of close fights. Travis Brown was a very, very... You know what? I'm going to throw Travis Brown in the F tier. I'm going to throw him into the F tier. He is a very, very underrated heavyweight. Extremely. Now, Zhang Weili. Zhang Weili is fairly rated. She is a killer in the division. She's going to reign the division for a long time. And I could be talking and people are like, well, you're overrating Zhang Weili. But I think she's fairly rated. Now, Brian Ortega. Ooh, this is an interesting one. What do people typically think about Brian Ortega? I don't know. People think that Brian Ortega will beat anybody except the champion. That's very possible. Yeah, Brian Ortega is fairly rated. Fairly rated. Rory McDonald, also fairly rated. Rory McDonald is well known to be a very, very all-around fighter. Should have been champion. Well, not should have been champion. Could have been champion beating Robbie Lawler. Very, very good fighter. Now, Clay Guida. Clay Guida. Where am I going to put Clay Guida? I also think that Clay Guida is fairly rated. Yeah, people know what we get with Clay Guida. Now, Cody Garbrandt's an interesting one. Cody Garbrandt is teetering the side between fairly rated and underrated because what's Cody Garbrandt's problem? Fight IQ. I mean, that's a big problem to have. Fight IQ and a chin. People know this, but people also talk about Cody Garbrandt like he's absolutely useless. So I will throw Cody Garbrandt in the underrated tier. Not completely underrated, teetering the line between fairly rated and underrated. Now, Frank Mir. This is an interesting one. Where do I want to throw Frank Mir? I don't know. If I don't know, I guess I would have to put them in fairly rated, right? Yeah, that's where I'll throw Frank Mir. Now, Kevin Lee, definitely underrated. Definitely underrated, but not to the level of Ben Askren and Travis Brown. Kevin Lee has lost some fights, but you have to look at Kevin Lee and all the close fights that he had. Look at his war with Tony Ferguson. Look at his war with Charles Oliveira. He's taken these guys and almost beating them. He's just almost getting there. Kevin Lee is a very, very good fighter. Now you can say something a little bit different than that, but Kevin Lee is a... Ooh. Is he to the level of Askren and Travis Brown? Because I'm thinking about how good he actually was. I'm going to move him. I'm going to move him down. Now, Khabib Nurmagomedov, fairly rated. One of the greatest fighters of all time. Junior Dos Santos, also fairly rated. You don't hear too much about him. The Korean Zombie, overrated. The Korean Zombie, I am a huge, huge fan of the Zombie. One of my favorite fighters, man. I wanted to, cry on his retirement. But, yeah, the technique's just not there. He has some boxing. Yeah, he can clip people. But his skill level does not stack up to the rest of the division. Or the rest of the UFC over there. Do we not? We don't have an S tier yet, eh? Anyways, Colby Chaos Covington. This one's tough. I think he's fairly rated. Yeah, people know what we get with Colby Covington besides his Leon Edwards fight. Now, Tony Ferguson. Absolutely overrated. Absolutely, absolutely overrated. Not S tier. I just realized that we have a B and an A tier. Oh, does this mean... Okay, that's strange. You know what? We're going to leave it like that. I just realized that we have 3 overrated tiers. I guess S tier is going to be something really, really special. Tony Ferguson is... Oh, if I put him in S tier, I am going to hear about it in the comments. Oh my god. But guys, like, Tony Ferguson got by on toughness. Tony Ferguson, people talk about Tony Ferguson like he was the one to beat Nurmagomedov, and that never would have happened. Even in hindsight, everybody's like, oh, Prime Tony would take on Habib. Prime Tony would beat Habib. Prime Tony is just as good skill-wise as the Tony Ferguson of today. It's just Tony's old now and is damaged. Oh, I'm going to hear about it. I can feel the dislikes coming. Man. Oh, boy. Brock Lesnar. Brock Lesnar is slightly overrated. He's big. He's steroided out. He outmuscles people. That's how he gets the job done. Shogun Rua. Shogun's underrated. Slightly underrated. Back in the day, this would be a different conversation, but right now, I'm talking about MMA fans who, like, look back on these fighters. Shogun is absolutely an underrated fighter. He was an absolute killer. Go watch his first fight with Dan Henderson. One of my favorite fights of all time. Amanda Nunes. Ooh, overrated. Overrated Amanda Nunes. She beat the brakes off of what is the equivalent of a division that is like, if I were to go in and fight a bunch of 12-year-olds. Like, that division is garbage. Raquel Pennington is champion in that division right now. I'm going to hear about it, dude. I can feel the dislikes coming. Amanda Nunes is so overrated. I don't care. She has power. Yeah, she has technique behind it, but she ruled the division. And, dude, it's literally like me going and boxing a bunch of 10-year-olds. And then being like, yeah, I'm double champion. I beat the 10-year-old division. I beat the 11-year-old division. Like, no, I'm here. I'm ready for these comments, dude. I'm ready for these comments. Jose Aldo, fairly rated. Everybody knows what we get with Jose Aldo. Alistair Overeem. I almost think that people are underrating Alistair Overeem. You know what? That's where I'm going to throw him. I'm going to throw him in the underrated because I know he had a chin issue, but you cannot argue against his skill set. Ben Rothwell, fairly rated. Robbie Lawler, overrated. Robbie Lawler is an overrated fighter. He is slightly overrated. He got by on his heart and brawling, just like Tony Ferguson. Robbie Lawler is an overrated fighter. He has technique. He is a good fighter. He's not like Tony Ferguson. Well, I'm not saying Tony Ferguson doesn't have any technique. It's just Tony really got by on his toughness. Robbie Lawler won a lot of fights because of his toughness, and Robbie Lawler also won his fair share of robberies too. Now, Cain Velasquez. Fairly rated for Cain Velasquez. Chael P. Sonnen, the most underrated fighter in UFC history. We're adding a Chael tier. No, I can't. I want to be objective about this tier list. Actually, guys, I actually would put him in underrated. The F tier. People look at Chael Sonnen and talk about how he just got by with his mouth. That is not the case. Chael Sonnen in his prime was a killer. Chael would take you down. You know when you would see those clips of Chael? I'm going to take him down and beat him up for 25 minutes or until he quits. That's what Chael Sonnen did. Chael only lost to really, really good fighters. And I understand that you can argue, and there's a lot of fighters, especially of this era, that I could talk about with PEDs. I'm just going to ignore that for today. We're going to take a look at the fighters and how they were. Chael Sonnen is incredibly underrated as a fighter. I'm going to move him. He is the most underrated fighter on this list, probably. Now, Chris Weidman. There's a lot of really tough ones on this list, but Chris Weidman is slightly underrated. People like to talk about his record and the guys he had wins over, but Chris Weidman was a killer in his prime, too. I think Chris Weidman is a very good fighter. Chuck Liddell. Fairly rated. I don't think we know what we're getting with Chuck Liddell. Yoel Romero, slightly overrated. He got by on his power. He was a little bit inactive until he landed a huge bomb. Well, that's not true. That's not really true. But I just think that Yoel isn't as good of a fighter, skill set wise, as people claim him out to be. People claim him out to be his Terminator, and I can't believe I lost money against Thiago Santos, man. I can't believe it, Yoel. What are you doing to me? Anyways, Joanna Jacek, fairly rated, very good fighter. Daniel Cormier, underrated. Absolutely underrated. Daniel Cormier is a contender to be one of the greatest of all time, and people look at him as the guy who got head kicked by John Jones. Daniel Cormier is an underrated fighter. Daniel Cormier is more deserving on the GOAT list than George St. Pierre. I know, oh man. Another thing that I'm going to hear about in the comments down below. Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, F tier, underrated. This dude is still putting in work and won championship. This dude, if he came back over to the UFC, he would still be championship. The only chance that somebody would have to beat him is if Figgy happened to chin him, which is a possibility. We've seen him chinned. But even if he would have ended up having a trilogy, Figueiredo, he would have won the trilogy. Demetrius Johnson's one of the greatest fighters of all time, and people aren't talking about him because he's not in the UFC and because the flyweight division was a little bit weaker at the time. Wanderlei Silva, slightly underrated. Slightly underrated because he was a killer back in the day. Now people look at him as the don't let me get close guy. Dominic Cruz. I think Dominic Cruz is slightly overrated because people just didn't know how to deal with his style. And then people talk about how much of a god he is with his movement, right? I think he's a very good fighter. He's very elusive, but we kind of figured out the game plan to beat Dominic Cruz at this point. And it's kind of weird that people took this long to figure it out. Let's keep going to Carlos Condit. Slightly underrated. Slightly underrated. Carlos Condit he's fantastic. He's absolutely fantastic and nobody talks about him. Francis Ngannou. Ooh. If we're talking about marketability, overrated. This guy's the biggest star to ever leave the UFC. Dana White really dropped the ball. Dana White's the one who fumbled the bag. I think Francis Ngannou is fairly rated. People know what we get with Francis Ngannou. Gunnar Nelson. Also fairly rated. Also fairly rated. Is this Diego Sanchez? Yes, it is. Diego Sanchez. Yeah, fairly rated. Fairly rated. Sorry, there's so many people in the fairly rated, guys. Now, Cowboy Cerrone is absolutely underrated. 100%, because people know the old Cowboys. I'm going to put him down here, actually. He is a very underrated fighter, Cowboy Cerrone. Only hardcore fans really know how good Cowboy was. Cowboy had all the technique in the world. Cowboy had cardio. Cowboy was a killer in his prime. I think Cowboy's a fantastic fighter. When Cowboy went on his run, when Cowboy was in his prime, he was destroying everybody up until he got a title fight, and then he would drop the ball in the biggest fight. That's how it worked with Cowboy Cerrone, but he was a great fighter. Dan Henderson, we know what we're getting. We know what we're getting. Gilbert Melendez. I think Gilbert Melendez is slightly underrated. He's a little bit better than what people remember him. Now, Gilbert Burns, as my father would say, useless crybaby Burns, but I don't feel that Gilbert Burns is useless. He might be a crybaby, but he is definitely not useless. I think he's a C tier. We know what we're getting with Gilbert Burns. Henry Cejudo, underrated. Underrated. People forget how good this guy was. People take a look at the cringe. People take a look at his retirement, and people are now remembering him by the way he's going out against Merab Dvalishvili. People are now talking about him and asking how good he really was when he was double champion. I think he's fantastic. He's the guy who beat Mighty Mouse. Close fight. I understand that people who thought that fight went to Mighty Mouse, but Henry Cejudo is one of the greatest fighters of all time. As Henry says, he is one of the greatest. I know Henry says he is but I don't know if he is at least one of the greatest combat sports athletes of all time. He is underrated. Now, Tito Ortiz, fairly rated. We know what we're getting. Jacare, F tier, underrated. Jacare was an absolute killer, man. Jacare Souza. If we had prime Jacare Souza right now, he'd be champion. I will argue with you on that. He would be champion. He would beat Dricus du Plessis, Sean Strickland, Israel Adesanya, prime Jacare Souza, and I would say the same thing about Gegard Mousasi. Those two are the best middleweights that I can think of right now. I'm sure there's other people that are up there with him, but Jacare Souza is one of the greatest fighters in the division. We got him when he was old. Prime Jacare Souza would have killed this middleweight division that we have right now. Max Holloway, fairly rated. We know what we're getting with Max Holloway. Is this... why am I having a blank here? Because this is Anderson Silva. Why am I having a blank here? My apologies, guys. I'm going to leave this one at the bottom. I'm having a blank on that one. Sorry, guys. My apologies. Sorry. Same over here. Crap. I don't have too much knowledge about these two fighters. I am very, very sorry, guys. I should have looked at this list before we actually got into it. Anderson Silva, fairly rated. Alexander Gustafsson. Everybody knows who Alexander Gustafsson was, and everybody knows that Alexander Gustafsson was the guy to beat John Jones. Everybody knows Alexander Gustafsson as a guy who's just old now, but he was a guy who beat Daniel, or almost beat Daniel Cormier, almost beat John Jones. Well, did beat John Jones. You could even give the Daniel Cormier fight to him. But everybody knows this about Gustafsson. I think he's fairly rated. Now, Benson Henderson. Interesting. Maybe, I think he's fairly rated, but people just don't talk about him. Because when you hear people talk about Benson Henderson, you don't hear that he sucks at all. You don't hear that he lacked skill set. You hear that he was a champion. Yeah, he's fairly rated. People remember Benson Henderson the proper way. Holly Holm, overrated. Yeah, A tier overrated. It's same kind of reasons for Amanda Nunes. But people don't talk about her like she is this crazy killer. People talk about her like she's a very good fighter. She loses half of her fights and keeps getting title fights. She just has that aura about her because she's always in a title fight. But Holly Holm is... I think she kind of sucks, man. I do. Israel Adesanya, fairly rated. Fabricio Verdum is an interesting one. I think he's also fairly rated. Sorry I'm putting so many people in the fairly rated, guys. I hope this is still pretty interesting to watch. TJ Dillashaw is an interesting one, too. At this point, I'd put TJ Dillashaw as slightly underrated because TJ was a contender to be one of the greatest of all time. It's just after his failed drug test, people are questioning that. People look at him and kind of laugh at him, but people are kind of forgetting the great fighter that TJ was. So I'm going to put him in slightly underrated. Vitor. I think he's fairly rated. I'm going to put Vitor there, and I have no clue who this dude is. I really don't. Anyways, my apologies, guys. Now, what's his name? Is this Koscheck? Fairly rated. Is this Luke Rockhold? Sorry, the picture's really, really small on my screen. Yep, that's Luke Rockhold. Okay. Luke Rockhold is a very underrated fighter. F tier. Luke Rockhold is one of the most underrated fighters of all time. I know he's a chin issue. People remember him as the conceive, believe, achieve, shut the fuck up guy. Luke Rockhold, like Jacare Souza, but almost the level of Jacare Souza. And Luke Rockhold has a win over Jacare Souza. Luke Rockhold was a killer. Luke Rockhold it's too bad because you take a look at a couple of these fighters and somebody like Alistair Overeem, somebody like Phil Hawes, somebody with all the technique in the world, somebody who's fantastic, to put it in modern day, Chidi Njokuani, but although I don't think he's as good as the fighters that I just mentioned, it's sad when you have these fighters that are so good and you find out they have a little bit of a chin issue. Luke Rockhold has all the technique in the world. He is one of the best middleweights ever. I really do believe that. Now, Matt Hughes, fairly rated. Is this Shevchenko? Sorry again, guys. The picture on my screen is super, super tiny. Valentina Shevchenko, slightly overrated. She ruled over a division and beat a bunch of nobodies. Now we have Michael Venom Page, underrated. People call him a can crusher. I disagree. We just saw what he came into the UFC and he actually can do. I think he's a slightly underrated fighter. That's pretty much all there is to it. Mirko Cro Cop, fairly rated. Lyoto Machida, fairly rated. Nick Diaz. I think Nick Diaz is underrated. Nick Diaz is nothing like Nate Diaz was. Nate Diaz is a crap fighter compared to his brother. Nick Diaz had great jiu-jitsu. Nick Diaz had great boxing, cardio. He put combinations together. I know that's Nate's strengths, but he is miles ahead of his brother, and Nick Diaz was championship material, and he was champion outside of the UFC. Nick Diaz is a very, very good fighter, although he's definitely not like a Luke Rockhold or a Demetrius Johnson. You know what I mean? He's just a very, very good fighter. Chris Cyborg, also overrated. She has power, she has technique, but she fights a bunch of nobodies. Now, Nogueira, fairly rated. Fairly rated. Pedro Munoz, F tier, underrated. Nobody talks about this guy. I know he loses, but he is fighting to the edge of his skin, man. He is fighting to the brink of death. This guy is fantastic, and that's why I'm such a big fan of him. He takes on the toughest of the tough opponents and almost beats them and just can't put it together. He is right. If you throw Pedro Munoz at the top of the division right now, if you throw Pedro Munoz against Sean O'Malley, yeah, he might lose, but he will fight his heart out. He will make it not an easy night in the park for you guys. Oh, I can't. Okay. Oh, it was really weird I said that word. My dog was going to start jumping on me. Oh boy, but she's tired. Hi, baby. Hi. Sorry. Oh boy. Anyways, Pedro Munoz is a severely underrated fighter. Moving on. I'm looking at the rest of this list over here. You know what I think I'm going to do, guys? I'm going to bang out the fairly rated on this list over here, and I apologize, I am having a blank on these last few fighters over here. But is this Rose Namajunas? This is Thug Rose Namajunas. I'm going to put the fairly rated fighters. Yeah, I'm just going to knock out the fairly rated over here and then continue the last little bit over here. Is Woodley fairly rated? I don't know. Yeah, Fedor's definitely fairly rated. Yeah, okay, that's what we're going to do. Robert Whittaker. Oh, is he fairly rated? I don't know. Is he fairly rated? Yeah, you know what? Robert Whittaker's fairly rated. Everybody knows he's a great fighter. Ronda Rousey. Fairly rated. I just went through it and put a few more fighters in the fairly rated so I wouldn't have to keep doing this. Thug Rose Namajunas. Maybe slightly overrated. You can't forget how many losses she actually does have, but she's a great fighter. She's a really, really good fighter. John Jones also fairly rated. What am I doing, man? What am I doing? Stipe's fairly rated. I'm sorry. Darren Till is also... Oh, both of these guys are fairly rated. Woodley, though. Woodley is an underrated fighter. Completely. People laugh at him for Jake Paul. People laugh at the fighter that Woodley became. People laugh at Woodley being the inactive fighter that he was when he was exiting his career. But this guy could have beat GSP. This guy could have beat Kamaru Usman in his prime. But then again, you could argue... I always have trouble talking about this because I do believe a prime Woodley would have beat or had a very, very good fight against Kamaru Usman, although I think Kamaru would have gotten the edge on Woodley, was when they fought, was that prime Woodley, because after that, he went on that incredible losing streak. You know, that's really tough to say. Let me know what you guys think in the comments about that, by the way. Woodley is a very underrated fighter, though. Now, the last fighter that I am going to do is Frankie Edgar. He's almost fairly rated, but people don't talk about him anymore. I think he's underrated because people also remember the way that Frankie Edgar ended up going out. So, that is my tier list for you. I am ready to hear it about the top guys. And believe me, I am a huge Korean Zombie fan. I love the Korean Zombie. I'm a fan of GSP. I'm a fan of Conor McGregor. Okay, guys? I'm a big fan of Dominic Cruz as well. Robbie Lawler. I just believe that some of these fighters are overrated. Let me know what you think about the tier list down below, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. Check out the video on screen right now. We will have 2 tier list videos on screen for you to check out if you'd like to keep watching the channel. I will see you either there or in the next video, everybody. Take care.